In this video, you're going to finish off the feature you started in the last one. Now, the goal here is to actually create and use start set expenses. I'm going to give you the usage. We'll go through that together, and it is going to be your challenge to set up this function. This function is going to look similar to the async action function above. And by similar, I mean it returns a function. We use Firebase somewhere inside of there, and then at some point later on, we dispatch. We're going to do the same process down here, but before we outline the process, I'm going to crack open app.js and actually use this thing that doesn't exist. Then all you'll need to do is fill out the function here. So in app.js, we're going to grab the thing that does not exist. Right here, we have an old import from add expense. We can leave everything in place except for the fact that we no longer want add expense. We want start set expenses. Start set expenses, once again, does not exist. You're going to be the one who actually creates it. Now we're going to use start set expenses in this file. So to see how, let's go ahead and kick things off by taking this line, copying it, and pasting it up above. What we're going to do is render a loading message to the screen until we get the data from Firebase, until we get that initial data. Then we'll actually render the application. So right here, what I'm going to do is just replace the JSX variable with a little message, and we'll work on styling that later. And for now, it can just say loading ... So we're going to have this loading paragraph showing up to the screen. At some point later on, we're going to run this code. In order to figure out when the expenses are actually fetched, we are going to dispatch right here using store.dispatch. We are going to dispatch the action we just imported, start set expenses. Start set expenses is not going to take any arguments, and it is going to return a promise. So we are going to be able to pass on then. We're going to be able to have our success case, and on success, we're going to render the application by taking that line and pasting it inside. So if we were to save this right now and start up the dev server, things would fail. It would fail because we're importing something that does not exist, then we try to use it, and at the end of the day, we're going to get just a big old mess. It's going to be your job to make this work, and the only thing you need to do to make it work is to create and fill out this function. So let's go ahead and talk about what I want you to do. But before we do, I am going to switch over to the dev server in the terminal. I'm going to shut down the test cases, use yarn run dev server. And once the dev server is up, we're just going to visit that real quick. Now I haven't saved app.js yet. I am going to go ahead and actually save it. And this will, as I mentioned, fail. So over here, localhost 8080, I can switch over to the browser, go over to localhost 8080, give things a refresh, and right off the bat, we are going to get some errors. So we see our loading screen, which is good, and we also see that start set expenses is not a function. That is the problem. We can fix that by exporting a function right here. So this is what start set expenses should do. Step 1, it is going to need to fetch all expense data once. Step 2, it is going to need to parse that data into an array. And if you forget how to do that, we did something very similar in the firebase.js file down below. If you remember, if you scroll down just a little bit, we did do some parsing. Where exactly is that? It's right here. So this is the example we used previously, and you can always download the lecture downloads if you don't have this code in place or you've lost it. Remember, we create the array, we iterate over the snapshot, we add all those items in. In this case, we just log them. What you're going to need to do is actually dispatch them. So we're going to parse that data into an array. Then step 3 would be to dispatch set expenses so the data actually changes. If you complete these 3 steps as expected, everything is going to work. You should be able to save this file, and you should start seeing the data from the development server showing up. If you don't have any data, you should be able to create some. Then that should show up, and you should be able to refresh and still see that data. Now, if you run into any problems while you get this done, just try to refer to the function up above. It's going to look similar in structure. So you're going to need to return a function. You're going to use dispatch to dispatch something. You're going to be using Firebase to return a promise. You're going to need to hit all of these points in order to get this working as expected. The good news is that you're not going to need to change anything else in your project. All you have to do is change this right here. Take some time to knock this one out. Try to get the app up and running. Hopefully you see the expense data. Either way, just give it an honest try. Pause the video, and when you're done, click play. All right, how'd that one go? I'm going to kick things off by creating start set expenses, and actually setting it equal to a function. Now this function doesn't need to take any arguments in since we're just going to be fetching expenses. So right away, we can return our function, and this is the function that has access to dispatch. This is exactly what we did up above for our only other asynchronous function. Now we are inside of here and we can start doing something with Firebase. In our case, what we need to do is fetch from Firebase. So I am going to be accessing database, which is already imported, .ref, to get the expenses ref. And this is what you needed to do as well. Now from here, we are going to access a single time all of the data stored at this location using .once. I'm going to get the value just one time. Then I will toss on then, and I will add my success case. So what do I want to do when I do get the data back? I want to go ahead and parse it. I get the snapshot, but the snapshot does not give me what I want. The snapshot would give me that object structure. I want to make sure to convert that over to an array structure. Before I do that, I'm also going to toss a return on here. This makes sure the promise actually gets returned, and that is what's going to allow us to have access to then right here, where we actually dispatch things. With all of this in place, all we need to do is fill out what's right inside of here. And the first step to getting that done is going to be to create a const expenses. We're going to start off with no expenses. Then we're going to go through the process of parsing the data using snapshot.forEach, just like we did over in the other file. ForEach is going to get called one time for every child. We're going to have access to that child snapshot, and I can call that child snapshot. Awesome. Now inside of here, we have to use expenses.push. You needed to actually push all of the expenses on the array. Right here, we're going to push on an object. The first thing, the ID, is going to come from the snapshot key property. That would be child snapshot.key. Now after that, what do we have? We want all of the values. So I'm going to spread out child snapshot.val. Now after ForEach, we're going to have access to that built up expenses array. And all we need to do is actually dispatch set expenses. I'm going to use dispatch. I'm going to call set expenses, the thing we created in the last video. Then I'm going to pass to set expenses what it expects, and it expects an array of expenses. I have access to an array of expenses right here. I pass in expenses, and there we go. Now, I didn't ask you to write any test cases. I just asked you to fill out this function, and hopefully you came up with something similar to this. We fetch the data, we parse the data, and we actually get the data in Redux. Now we can go ahead and remove the comments down below. I'm going to save the file and see what happens. Start set expenses should exist, and it should actually get our data back. Right here, we can see we went from the loading screen to the app screen. I have from dev and from real site all showing up because those are in Firebase. Now I could even create a new one. I could call this one something new from site. I could give it an amount of $34.50 and I could add it. When I add it, it's going to show up on the list, but it always did that. So let's actually refresh things and make sure it stays around. It should stay around because we fetch the data. Right here, we are getting something new from site. We are getting our correct price and date, $34.50 on August 21st. So there we go. We have our asynchronous action in place. This one fetches the data and gets it all inside of Redux. Now, before we go, I do want to add a test case for start set expenses, and since this is the first time we've ever tested something using our Firebase dummy data, we can move through the process together. So I'm going to close down every other file except for the actions test file. We really just need these two in order to get the job done. And what we're going to do is create a new test case down at the bottom. At the bottom, test. Right here, we can add the test case should fetch the expenses from Firebase, and we're going to go ahead and actually add our arrow function in, and then we can start the test case. Now, like the other test cases in this file that do take advantage of the asynchronous functionality, we are going to need to create that mock store, go through the process of making the request, and then assert something about one of the actions that were dispatched. That is exactly what we're going to do here. We wouldn't expect the Firebase database to change at all, so there is no need to query it inside of the test case. Step one is to create that mock store. Const store equals, we are going to use the create mock store function we defined at the top of the test file, and in this case we do not need any data in the store. What we are going to do though is go through the process of dispatching start set expenses. Up at the very top, I am going to need to import that on the end. Start, set, expenses. And once I do have it imported down at the very bottom, we're going to go ahead and dispatch it. We're going to dispatch it on our mock store. That would be store.dispatch. Right here, we are going to call the thing we just imported, start, set, expenses. We're not going to need to pass in any arguments since it takes none, and at this point it should be going off and grabbing all of the dummy Firebase data that we just set up. We can now make some assertions about what happened after the fact. I'm going to toss on then to wait for the data to actually be fetched, then we can look at the fake actions. Since I am creating an asynchronous test case, I will provide done right here, letting Jest know not to consider this test a success or a failure until done is called. Inside of here, I'm going to start by getting the actions. Const actions equals store.get actions. Now we have all of the actions back and we can take a look at them. And there really should just be one, and that's the only one we care about. So I'm going to expect. I'm going to access actions. I'm going to grab the item at the 0 index, the first item, and I am going to expect it to equal, and I'm going to expect it to equal some object. Now inside of here, what are we going to expect? Well, I am going to expect that the type was set expenses. If everything went well, it should have dispatched set expenses correctly with the data it found from Firebase. Next up is the actual expenses themselves. Now for these ones, we don't even need to do anything. We would just expect that all of the seed data, all of the data in our fixtures file is the data that we actually get back, since that's the exact data we set on Firebase right here. Down below, that means we don't need to change anything else inside of toEqual. All we need to do is call done. Now that we have this in place, we should be able to save the test file and run the test suite. From the terminal, I'm going to run it just a single time by clearing the output and using yarn test. This is going to run the Jest test suite, and hopefully we are seeing a completely passing test suite. Right here, it looks like that is exactly what we're getting. The last thing that we're going to do in this video is going to be to commit and deploy. Now, committing and deploying takes a while, so I'm not going to do it too much more throughout the course. In this part of the video, it is going to be your challenge to make a commit, get it up on GitHub, and deploy it to Heroku, and then make sure all of the data in the Firebase database actually shows up in the live version of the app. So take some time to knock that one out, make sure everything is showing up as expected, then you can go ahead and click play. All right, let's move through the process one more time. Git status shows us all of our files. Here, we just have modified files, which means we don't need to use git add, though we could. Instead, we can just use git commit with the A flag and the M flag, or the combined AM flag, and then we can provide our message. Get Firebase expenses on start. I can use git push to push this up to GitHub to back up the code, collaborate with others, or do whatever else I want with it. And then I can use git push Heroku master to deploy. Since this is going to take a moment, I'm just going to cut to when it's complete, and then we'll come back. All right, everything was deployed. Let's go ahead and test out the deploy by moving over to the live version of the app. I'm going to give things a refresh, and hopefully what we see is the same data we're seeing over here, the data that was indeed saved to Firebase. Right here, we do indeed get that data. Something new from site, from dev, from real site. It is all showing up as expected. Now that we have this in place, there are just a few more things we have to handle. We have to handle the ability to remove an expense and update an expense. We're going to work on removing an expense next. I'm excited to get to that, so stay tuned, and I will see you in the next video.